I'm Matthew Silverman, the Executive Director of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies. Welcome to our program tonight with Dr. Lauren Strauss on American Jewish advocacy. We look forward to an engaging and thought-provoking lecture with an opportunity at the end for questions. Thank you again for joining us, and I'm now going to turn the screen over to our Vice President, Art Hessel, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Matt, and everybody welcome. We have a large group tonight. That's always good. The Haberman Institute is doing this in conjunction with the Jewish residents of Leisure World. We've partnered with them before in life, and now we're partnering with them in cyberspace, and the same with Temple Kol Shalom of Rockville, who has become one of our regular partners. So we're really happy to have so many people involved. Most of you probably have been to Haberman events before. You know that our goal is to provide high quality, in-depth encounters with Jewish thought and history and culture, and that is part of what we are doing tonight. Before we get to tonight's program, though, I would like to talk for a second about the next program, which is Sunday, this coming Sunday, 1 o'clock our time, and it's 1 o'clock our time because our guest is speaking from Israel. And the guest is speaking with Rabbi Gordy Fuller, who, as most of you know, was the executive director of the Haberman Institute for 3 years, ending less than a year ago. The program is in his honor. He will be in conversation with Professor Paul Lips, who has a long career teaching at Tel Aviv University and at Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem. And they're going to talk about the role of Jewish communities in supporting other Jewish communities around the world. To what extent is that a responsibility of one Jew in one country and one hemisphere to come to the rescue or support of another Jew or Jewish community in another part of the world? Tonight we are, you can register for that program on our website, www.habermaninstitute.org. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with the website. Tonight's lecture, I'm excited to introduce my old friend, Lauren Strauss, who I haven't seen since before the pandemic started. So it's good to see you, Lauren. Lauren is a scholar in residence and the director of undergraduate studies in the Jewish Studies program at American University here in Washington. She teaches courses in a number of subjects. She teaches both ancient and modern Jewish history. She teaches Jewish history and literature. She teaches modern Israel and Israeli and American Jews and Holocaust literature and art and so much more, including gender and sexuality and Jews and the American political tradition, which is where we're going tonight. You may know her because before Gordy Fuller, who was the executive director before Matt Silverman, Lauren for 5 years was the executive director of this organization then called the Foundation for Jewish Studies. So we know Lauren well, and many of you know her not only as a professional, but personally. Lauren is the co-editor of a book called Mediating Modernity, Challenges and Trends in Jewish Encounters with the Modern Mind. She has a book coming out soon called Painting the Town Red, which is about Jewish visual artists, Yiddish culture, and radical politics in interwar New York. And she is writing another book now on the history of DC area Jews, that's us, and their political activism. Lauren has a lot to share with us tonight. As Matt said, you can ask her questions in the Q&A. Matt will moderate the questions after she finishes speaking. And I look forward and turn this event over to Dr. Lauren Strauss.
Thank you, Art. It's so good to see you. I wish I could see everybody in person. And so I'll start with that as a wish. I hope that all of you are healthy and doing well. You know, here we are Zooming together. So we're taking advantage of our technology. I will actually, since Art just reminded me, I will start out with a public service announcement on my own behalf. As Art mentioned, I'm finishing one book, but the people on this call, unless they're Zooming in from elsewhere, are the perfect people for me to speak to for my next book that I'm starting to research soon. And it will be on American Jews in Washington, D.C., in the D.C. area, focusing on everything from the interwar period to the early 70s, and especially political and cultural activism, especially emphasis on political. So I'm just going to start out by giving you my email address. And if you've been in DC for a long time and want to set up a talk with me, a Zoom or something, and tell me how you got here or how your parents got here, and about your professional history, and especially if you or someone you know is politically active, I would love to hear it. So my email address is Strauss, Strauss, at american.edu. Very simple. Thank you in advance for that. So tonight we are going to cover a lot of ground, and there's always more, and that is because talking about American Jews in politics is almost an infinite subject, I have learned, and in particular the way I approach it, which is politics writ large, not electoral politics. We know that's on everyone's mind, but in a larger sense, the idea behind these United States, the idea behind the formation of America, and in particular, its relationship to minorities, to minority rights, and looking at the other axis of this, at the American axis, what has been the Jewish experience here and comparatively in other countries, and how have American Jews really in a unique way rallied to engage themselves and immerse themselves in the American political landscape in a way that they really have not elsewhere in the diaspora, and in a way that other minority groups in America really haven't quite to the same extent. So that we actually see many, many times groups that sometimes are quite adversarial, have an adversarial relationship with the American Jewish community, turning to either individual Jews or looking at American Jewish institutions as models for how to exercise their own rights in sometimes pretty strange ways. And we'll explore some of those this evening. So I want to start at the beginning of the 20th century. And so we're only going to cover about 120 years here, a little less than 120 years, which is nothing in Jewish history. And I'm going to screen share, hopefully, and show you my slides and talk while I talk about cases, while I show you some slides. And then, as Art mentioned, I'll take questions at the end. We have the chat feature is disabled so that everybody's comments don't flash across the screen for everyone to read, but you're more than welcome to submit questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and then I'll take those at the end. So I'm going to look at a couple of categories, a couple of big questions. The first of these has to do with labor rights, worker rights, and in a wider sense, the relationship between workers and owners of or bosses of companies, and the way to address grievances, and in some sometimes very sensationalist ways. Then we're going to look at part A of anti-Americanism or fears of, and where the Jews and American Jews fit into that. Then we will look at the issue of where we live, neighborhoods, who has the right to determine where someone lives, how they live, what buildings get built in certain areas, and what rules about residents can be enforced, who enforces them, etc. And all of these were chosen because they are all issues that American Jews have taken both sides of. So that's really the deciding factor here. We go on to, again, to what we might call anti-Americanism, fear of, that's part B. And then we get to issues of religious freedom or religion in the public square. Finally, we get to the big one these days, free speech versus hate speech, the dangers of allowing everybody to have their say and express themselves publicly versus the dangers of not allowing everyone to express themselves publicly. So I'll reiterate that all of these issues are cases or have cases in which American Jews were prominently represented on both sides of the issue. I would say both sides of the aisle because I'm in DC, but I will refrain. So I hope that the screen share thing will work. And hold on. Aha. See my nice turquoise background there? Okay, just somebody who's one of the co-hosts, please let me know if people can see it before I start talking. So someone.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, all right, thank you. Okay, so we start, as I said, in the early 20th century with a case that is, or a general subject that is perhaps familiar to many of you. And this is in the area of labor rights. Now, as you may know, American Jews, especially the East European Jewish immigrant community that came here mostly starting in the 1880s and came right up until World War I. Then there was a little break in allowing people into the country for 4 years. Then more of them came for the next 3 to 6 years. And then immigration was largely shut down again. So this immigration, which would number about 2.5 million Jews out of a total of about 25 million immigrants from around the world coming to this country in this 40-year period. So you see here that 10% of immigrants coming from around the world at this time were Jews. About 90 to 95% of them were East or Central European Jews, mostly East European, from places like Russia, Romania, Hungary, Poland, etc. And their native language for 97.5 of them, 0.5% of them, their native language was Yiddish. And this is of crucial importance. They were poor, they were working class. They came with menial skills that mostly situated them in light industry, especially what? If you were in front of me, probably many of you would be yelling it out, the schmata industry, the garment district. It is estimated that over 95% of American Jewish immigrants who came during that era from Eastern and Central Europe at some point during their lives in the United States would work in the garment industry. And the vast majority of them would be represented in and actually forming the labor unions that were so prominent in the garment industry. So where's the conflict in the Jewish community? I just told you that most of them were working in the same industry. Yes, that is true. But what we see, if we look at the actual flow of ownership, is that people moved up as quickly as they could. And so it was the case at the beginning of this period of immigration that most factories and the smaller, what you would call sweatshops, of the garment industry, especially in New York City, especially on New York's Lower East Side, but not only, also in Boston and Chicago, and other densely populated Jewish immigrant neighborhoods. These smaller sweatshops, the small or medium-sized factories and the larger factories were initially owned in the 19th century, in the mid-19th century, by non-Jews, mostly Germans. Toward the end of the century, they became owned often by German Jews. But by the time of the real onslaught of immigration, most of them were owned by Russian Jews. I'm saying Russian as a very, very general way of referring to East Europeans. So the bosses, the so-called bosses, the people owning these factories, were themselves from the exact same background. So when the people were uniting and creating the garment labor unions, they were demonstrating against and striking against people with exactly their same backgrounds, Yiddish speakers, people sometimes from their same towns. Now, probably the most famous organizer, if you had to choose one, and there were many, was a very diminutive, rather young woman named Clara Lemlich. Actually, Chelsea Clinton wrote a book about great American women or something a couple of years ago, and she included Clara Lemlich in the book, but she didn't say that she was Jewish. She's, of course, a Yiddish-speaking immigrant, and here she is in 1909, and this is in Cooper Union, which still stands in Greenwich Village, and this is where she addressed the crowd of thousands who were debating whether or not they should strike. Why would they strike? Because their conditions were so terrible. Among other things, they had, during high season, 16-hour workdays, sometimes longer. They were allowed one short break during that time. There was rampant sexual harassment against the mostly young women who were working in this industry. They were usually charged by the bosses for electricity that they used to run their sewing machines to make the clothing for the businesses, et cetera, et cetera. So finally, in the winter of 1909, a group of leaders got together and they proposed a strike, and they're debating it. And this is the picture you see here in Cooper Union. Finally, Clara Lemlich gets up literally on the platform and she yells in Yiddish, "Enough of this talk. Whoever is for a strike, follow me." And the crowds roar, including the Italian girls, who were the other major ethnic group represented in the garment district. That much Yiddish they understood. How did you say strike in Yiddish? Strike. So it wasn't so hard. She raises her right hand and asks the crowds to utter an oath to follow her into this strike. And they do. It sounds too dramatic to be true, but it really is. And this is how the so-called strike of the 20,000 or uprising of the 20,000 is born. And they go through a very, very difficult winter, the winter of 1909-1910, bitter cold temperatures in New York. People die. They die of exposure, and they die because the bosses, remember, these are East European Jews as well, they are hired thugs to beat up the strikers and the demonstrators. Clara Lemlich, who's barely 5 feet tall, had her ribs broken. She was beaten up 17 times, but she persisted. Finally, a truce is, some kind of truce is effected. And what is that truce called? It's a document that's hammered out between lawyers on both sides, and its name is the Protocol of Peace, 1910. Now, what's remarkable about this document is the following. First of all, who are the main lawyers who hammer it out? Well, one lawyer was brought down from Boston because he was known to specialize in labor law. His name was Louis Brandeis. He hangs around long enough to really get the case going and then hands it off to his colleague, Louis Marshall, one of the leaders of the American Jewish community at the time. But what's remarkable about this, and the reason that it's so important for our topic tonight, is that as one journalist observed when she, female journalist, sat in the room and observed the negotiations was this. She said, everyone in this room is a Jew, except for one person. I don't know who they are. The lawyers on both sides, the bosses, the sweatshop workers, the people covering it, all of the journalists, all of the news people. It was being held in Yiddish and English, and it goes on and on. It was because this was the Jewish-speaking immigrant world, but at the same time, they're hammering out rights and regulations that would impact all of American labor. What happened? Not a pretty tale, not a happy story. What happens next? Because out of 450 shops, that's what they called the different factories and sweatshops, out of 450 shops that were striking, 400 of them signed the Protocol of Peace. They agreed to give shorter work hours and longer breaks and to stop charging for the electricity they used. But 50 of them did not sign the Protocol of Peace, including, here are some strikers, including one factory in particular. And I bet a lot of you are guessing what that was. Yes, it was the Triangle Factory, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, right near Washington Square. In fact, the building still stands and is owned today by New York University. And on March 25th, 1911, the worst workplace tragedy in the history of the country occurred there. 146 workers were killed in less than a half hour. Many of them burned to death by the flames that swept through the unregulated factory. And many of them were so-called jumpers who were jumping out of the window to escape the extreme heat. Unfortunately, tragically, even though fire engines, as you can see here, raced to the scene immediately, this is 1911, I believe they had horses, there were no ladders in New York City that reached higher than the 6th floor. And the water, the hoses that were being directed at the windows were really no match for the extreme heat. So 146 victims, mostly young immigrant Jewish and Italian women, about 120 of them with about 24 men, lost their lives. Tragedy, horror, yes. But something else came out of that as well. Something that was also born out of the American Jewish Yiddishist labor movement, and that would have ramifications for all of American labor. What did they do? First, they got sad, and then they got angry. And they rallied first right here on April 5th, only days after the fire. And as you see in this fairly famous photo of it, each labor union is rallying behind its specific banner, calling on the allegiance of their workers to coalesce and to direct their anger and make it productive. This march, this rally and sort of funeral march that took place in April, drew when combining the marchers and the people standing on the streets on either side, it drew between 300 and 350,000 people. Still to this day, one of the largest gatherings in New York City. And what was the effect? Well, unfortunately, the criminal case against the Jewish owners of the Triangle Factory, Blank and Harris, that case was lost on a technicality, but 3 years later, a civil case was won. And not only that, but over the course of the next 3 years following the fire, New York State saw its first workplace safety laws passed, 36 laws passed over the next 3 years, and ultimately the creation of what we know as OSHA, which is the Federal Workplace Safety Office. Going on from that, but in the same era, we have a person who brings out excuse me, a larger issue, one that had begun to dog the heels of the people demonstrating. And that issue came out of fear. Why? Because around this same time, in the 19 teens, there are isolationist forces growing. People who are wearying, who long ago wearied of these foreigners, these people who spoke funny languages and cooked overly fragrant food and had many children and were darker and shorter and had curly hair, objectionable things like that. There were nativists, immigration restrictionists, who were absolutely set on the idea of prohibiting more people like this from sullying the shores of this country. And they focused on certain individuals, one of whom was called the most dangerous woman in America, Emma Goldman, her nickname being Red Emma. And she was pretty dangerous. She was a great speaker, and she was a diehard confirmed anarchist. She and her partner, romantic and also political partner, Alexander Berkman, believed in the overthrow of the system, of the American system, and also government as we know it. And that is a fact. But she spent most of her time in dangerous activities like advocating for birth control to become legal, because birth control, thanks to the Comstock laws of the 1870s, was illegal in this country. Not only that, it was illegal to talk about birth control or contraception or to mention body parts. You could be thrown in jail immediately under so-called obscenity laws. So Emma Goldman spent a lot of her time lecturing about that. And before Margaret Sanger opened what would become Planned Parenthood, Emma Goldman was advocating for women's health clinics that would help with reproductive freedom for women at the turn of the century. Dangerous, dangerous woman. Well, the direction that this took would have ramifications on you could say, the psyche of American Jews for a very long time. And what was that direction? It was fear. It was fear of the strange and suspicion and making American Jews suspect of representing all kinds of un-American and anti-American philosophies. World War I, we have the proliferation of political cartoons and also posters like this. You want to buy a war bond? You can do that and prove that you're 100% American. Not sure what that means, 100% American. Prove it. Buy those war bonds and prove that you're not one of those foreigners, that you aren't wishing for the overthrow of this government. There were laws passed, sedition laws, and other laws that had to do with quelling free speech around World War I. Remember, this country did not enter the war for the first 3 years. World War I began in 1914. The United States didn't enter until 1917. And so there was great isolationist sentiment in this country. And when the US entered the war, there was anger. There was a lot of anger at anybody who had a foreign accent. Jews, Germans were beaten up in the streets, German non-Jews, etc. And so this planted a seed of fear to some degree in parts of the American Jewish community. This wasn't helped by the fact that the year after the war was over, 1919, 1920, was the first Red Scare. You think McCarthy was the Red Scare. He was the second one. The first one was 1919, 1920. when suspect aliens, mostly Russian Jews and Italians, especially people who were anarchists, but also people who were socialists and who didn't support any particular political ideology, could be taken out of their homes in the middle of the night in the so-called Palmer raids, named for the then US Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer. And in many cases, those immigrants were deported, and they could be deported without trial if they were not citizens. So this is there in the psyche of American Jews. How do we balance? How do we make sure that we're not going to be suspected of being anti-American? But at the same time, how do we ensure our rights as Americans? Well, we go on to the issue of that I mentioned before of where can we live? What neighborhoods are ours? And so there is a long history, actually, of American Jews who are, again, on both sides of the issue of how you can and whether you should regulate where people live based on their background, their ethnic affiliation, their religious affiliation, their race, etc. Some of these issues got pretty contentious, as we see in the 1930s, and of course we're now in the Depression era, with rent strikes that took place in many places in New York. Here we see, when this is Allerton Avenue in the Bronx, and here we see the Lower East Side in Manhattan, but also in other cities as well, Chicago being one. Again, this provoked a tension between not only people in those cities in general, but between people in the Jewish community, because more often than not, the landlords that the rent strikers were demonstrating against, and they were doing that either when their own rent was raised beyond what they could pay, especially in the Depression, or when neighbors and friends of theirs who had lost their jobs in the Depression were being evicted from their apartments without any recourse. Who were the owners of the buildings? Usually other Jews. So again, this is a sort of internecine quarrel that has great ramifications for the larger society. And we see this issue of sort of who gets to regulate where we live and who can live there, extending farther into the century. Probably the most famous development, housing development in US history, of course. Maybe some people listening have lived there, and certainly people have visited there, is this one, is Levittown. Now this is Levittown, New York, which is the more famous one, even though there's a Levittown in Pennsylvania that was built first. Levittown, named for its builder. Builders, I think, tend to like to do that. And the builder, of course, was a man named Bill Levitt, William Levitt. And he was an American Jew, and he was a veteran. He was a veteran of the US Army. And he had been, during the war, during World War II, he had been in charge of moving large materials, things like prefab concrete sides of buildings that were used to build barracks and roofs and tractors and other building material. Well, quite brilliantly, when the war ended, the United States still had a lot of these materials, and there was a glut, and they were low cost. And he went into business working hand in hand with this wonderful sounding thing. It was a wonderful thing called the GI Bill, right? Many of you are familiar with the GI Bill. Maybe some of your parents bought houses and received educations because of the GI Bill. It was a wonderful idea to reintegrate returning veterans into this society, etc. However, there were laws that either didn't exist yet or were not enforced yet about who could live in these houses that were being offered under the GI Bill. And of course, what ended up happening was the creation of many, many housing developments or neighborhoods, not necessarily developments per se, that had what we call, what we know of as restrictive clauses. Jews were subject to many of them, Jews more than almost any other group. Catholics also, and Irish, and certain other groups, immigrant groups from other countries, were also kept out of certain neighborhoods because of restrictive clauses. But the number one group that was affected by a combination of these restrictive clauses and the we've heard a lot about this year, this practice of a combination of the banks and the real estate industry known as redlining. The main group that was affected by this were African Americans looking to build or to buy houses and apartments in neighborhoods that were designated either by the developer or by the other inhabitants or by the municipality itself as not available to people of color. Of course, they weren't called people of color then. So why Levittown? Why am I picking on Levittown? Well, because some of its inhabitants chose it to pick on themselves. We had a very famous case in 1957 where a group of left-wing or left-leaning, let's say progressive Jews who were permitted to buy houses there because Levittown was not restricted to Jews. Remember, Bill Levitt himself was a Jew, and he probably wouldn't have done that. And so they were living there quite happily, and they were what we call, what became known as red diaper babies, people whose parents had been active in either the communist movement or just the general American left in the 1920s and 30s, when it was perfectly legal to do so in this country. And many, many tens of thousands of American Jews were involved in left-wing political groups. That's one of the things, the book I'm writing now is about that. And so a lot of the people who were active in the 20s and 30s then brought their children up to espouse similar views. Of course, children don't always agree with their parents, but there is this phenomenon known as red diaper babies. Maybe some of you are out there listening to me. So I'd love to hear from you. Well, a certain family, a couple called the Wexlers, a Jewish couple, Lou and Bee Wexler, decided that it bothered them. It went against everything they believed in, that they knew very well that Black Americans couldn't move into their neighborhood in Levittown. So not coincidentally, they decided to come up with a test case. And in various ways, partly through coincidence, Bee Wexler met a young woman whose last name was Decatur, and she's African American. And she and her husband and two little kids were looking for a place to live. And Bee said to her, "Would you be willing to be our test case?" And so they were. And the reaction, the response from the Levittown administration, for Mr. Levitt himself, though he wasn't actually directly involved very much, though he had full knowledge of the restrictive covenants, and of a certain number of other Jewish residents of the town and the development who were very concerned about their property values falling, were very, very, very angry at the Wexlers and their supporters. So much so that they and the Decaturs, the young African-American couple, received all kinds of physical threats, had things done to their homes, etc. In the end, Levittown was integrated. It grew and grew, as you can see, and It's very planned. You see here the center with the municipal buildings, town hall, baseball field, all American, etc. And 60 years after the advent of the Levittown model, they still exist and they're quite integrated. However, the animosities lingered. And the Saturday Evening Post, which I don't think exists anymore, ran an incredibly damning ad in the early 1960s that reflected the Saturday Evening Post, just to be clear, is not itself saying this. They are bringing out that these things are being said in society. Would you panic if a Negro moved next door, they ask? I'm broad-minded, said one homeowner when Negroes moved into his block. But a short time later, he panicked and sold his house at a loss. So the Saturday Evening Post is doing an expose here in the early 1960s about how politics and social issues are often guided by economics and by personal interest. This is really an early time to be for them to be really discussing these issues at this level, because this is still a time when people who are developers and city planners who are expanding perceived services, building large projects like bridges and highways, and very, very large community centers and municipal buildings, are really, for the most part, hailed as heroes, right? And from a distance, and in many ways, that's true. And would be true if only, as we see in the premier example, probably in the entire century, nice Jewish boy, if only they weren't also, as a matter of course, looking at poor and minority communities as the ones that tended to be raised, meaning R-A-Z-E-D, knocked down, not raised up, in order to make those bridges and tunnels and beautiful parks happen. So here we have, again, we have one figure, easily the most public figure, advocating for development. This is his vision, his dream, at the World's Fair in Queens, that some of you may remember, 1964, toward the end of his career. And Robert Moses literally changed the face of certainly Manhattan, but also much of New York. It's hard to look at a major project from the late 40s for the next 20 years that he does not have a finger in. Some kind of involvement. He's identifiably Jewish. He's not at all religiously observant or involved, but he's identifiably Jewish. And people on the other side, people demonstrating against these large projects being built as planned. Not that they're against bridges and tunnels, but they're against the sort of discriminatory policies they feel that are targeting almost exclusively poor and minority neighborhoods to accomplish these projects. And they do point to the fact that he is Jewish, whether or not he feels that, particularly Jewish, or that that's a connection, isn't the point. The point is that the people demonstrating on the other side, and often, more than likely, the organizers of these efforts to block his projects, which rarely succeed, those demonstrations, they are often Jews themselves, often the same red diaper babies as the Wexlers and other people who are involved in these issues. And they bring out the fact of his Jewishness as a way of sort of shaming him. He's not at all ashamed. And saying, you shouldn't be doing this. This shouldn't be our position in the society. On the other hand, there are many people in the established Jewish community who have legitimately wonderful things to say about the beautiful parks that Robert Moses is building, etc. And again, they are saying this in the context of them being in representing the established Jewish community. In Washington, D.C., this took very personal form. Mostly in the late 1960s and early 70s. And it was brought out by a group of fairly rabble-rousing students and a couple of rabbinic figures and some other people who had mostly moved to the DC area. Some were native to DC, who formed an organization, an activist organization called Jews for Urban Justice. Some of you may know or know of Arthur Wasco, who later would become a rabbi. He's one of the founders of JUJ. And JUJ, as they call themselves, very, very active organization. Employed some techniques that people I've interviewed from JUJ themselves say were a little more than a little bit obnoxious, and they and their targets specifically were other Jews in the community who they felt were undermining the values that made this country great and that afforded rights to all sorts of people to live in peace and equality in this society, including but not limited to Jews. That's their mandate. And the people that they were organizing against were by and large major developers, real estate developers in the DC area, most of whom, at least the people they demonstrated against, most of whom were Jews. And if you live in the DC area, you know the names. They're on extremely philanthropic families. Their names are on every synagogue, every cultural institution, sports centers, etc., building and supporting the arts, etc. But JUJ also pointed out that in a number of cases, developers upheld restrictive clauses, particularly against renting or selling to Black Americans and others. And they did not stint. They really didn't hold back in their approbation of their community members who they felt should not be doing that because they were Jews. They used, I mean, look at the button. This was the central organizing principle behind their organization. It was not a by the way kind of detail. So now we turn a little bit back to something that I mentioned in the context of Emma Goldman. And with all of this in mind, all of these really fraught issues and things that could be embarrassing and upsetting and potentially even dangerous to the people who are on either side, we come back to the idea of the concept of fear and suspicion and what it means to be accused of being anti-American and alien and subversive and all of those things. You remember that I told you that it was absolutely legal and quite popular in the 1920s and 30s to be a member of the Communist Party in this country, and that many Jews were. And topic for another day, we can explore why even people who were not ideologically orthodox Marxists often either joined the party or what were so-called fellow travelers because of various things that they felt were attractive about the party. Well, there was a young couple who joined the party in the 1930s, and they were Orthodox Marxists, small o, not in a religious sense, Orthodox Marxists, true believers, dedicated communists. What were their names? You know their names. Ethel and Julius, the Rosenbergs. This is them in happier times, And this is in the 1940s, around when they got married and started having their kids, Michael and Robert, their two little boys, who were born, let's see, in the around 45 and 47. And here in much more fraught times for them. This is their famous arrest photograph, not exactly a mugshot, but this is after the two of them had been arrested on charges of espionage, spying for the Soviet Union, and they're being transferred. I think they had just had an arraignment. And they are being transferred to prison, and they're not even allowed to actually sit next to each other. They are separated by this sort of wire in the vehicle in which they're being transported. And you see Ethel is dressed nicely and trying to make a good impression. As is well known, the Rosenbergs, after 2 years of appeals, after they're immediately sentenced to death in their trial in 1951. They had been arrested earlier, a little bit earlier, 1950. They're sentenced to death. And they spend 2 years submitting appeals, and worldwide protests and movements are agitating on their behalf, to no avail. After many, many appeals and stays of execution, and the involvement of people all up and down the political spectrum, actually, with some very important exceptions, their last appeal is rejected, and they are both executed by electric chair on Friday evening, right before sundown, June 19th, 1953. As I mentioned, they have two little boys, Michael and Robert, who are orphaned as a result. We'll get back to them later. The Rosenbergs are one of the most famous cases in American history. They remain to this day the only accused spies or people who are civilians who are executed by the United States during peacetime for supposed spying. I mean, this is technically, it's peacetime, even though it's during the Cold War. As is well known, with recently released evidence by, particularly upon the death of one of Julius's co-workers, it appears that Julius was guilty of passing some low-level atomic secrets onto a Soviet contact person, and that Ethel was not. There's much more nuance. There are tens of thousands of pages on this case, of course, that we could get into. But my purpose here in bringing them up is not so much the details of their case, but the response, the reaction that it provoked in the world and among American Jews. On the one hand, as I said, there are worldwide protests. You see protesters here demanding justice for the Rosenbergs, calling it a frame-up, etc. People ask for mercy for Ethel so that their children won't be left orphaned, etc., etc. Over here, we have the newspaper showing their ultimate fate. What about American Jewry? What was American Jewry doing at the time? Not very much. So this is the introduction of what it means to be fearful. This is 1953, or it's 51 to 53. McCarthy is going ahead full steam. HUAC, the House Un-American Affairs Committee, had been convened before McCarthy became its public face, back in 1947. The post-war immediate rush into the Cold War meant that anybody who was suspected of even knowing or being friends with or neighbors or a teacher of someone with leftist sympathies, forget even being a member specifically of the Communist Party, having been to a party, as in a social event, was enough to incriminate someone. And the organized American Jewish community was not about to jeopardize their position in society. By and large, they either remained silent and did not come out in support of the Rosenbergs, who, as I said, Julius was probably guilty to some extent, but his sentence was unusual. And on the contrary, or not really on the contrary, but sort of a different strategy taken by wonderful and very helpful organizations to American Jews, such as the American Jewish Committee and the ADL. Their answer was not specifically to talk about the Rosenbergs, to say whether they thought they were guilty or not, but to organize arms of their organizations that specifically served as PR wings for showing the public how American and upstanding Jews were, and how American it is to accept all religions and races and ethnicities equally. So the American Jewish Committee, for instance, started producing commercials and radio shows. Probably the most famous production is a delightful, about 10 minutes, you can find it on YouTube, 10-minute clip of, it's like a mini film of Frank Sinatra in 1945 singing a song called The House I Live In. And as he breaks up a fight, a street brawl between boys in the street who are bullying one other little boy who's a little bit darker than they are. He's not that dark though. And Frank Sinatra, who's on a break from his studio, it starts out with him singing. He comes out and he goes, "Hey fellas, what are you fighting about? You're a Greek and you're an Irishman and you're a Jew." And he does mention the Jews. "You should all work together. You shouldn't be fighting each other because you're all American." He does make rather anti-Asian slur where he talks about all those good Americans joining together during the war to bomb the Japs. But this is the lingo that is being used to show that American Jews, Catholics, Protestants, Irishmen, Italians, Jews again, etc., are all have the potential of being good Americans. So this is the answer, not to really deal with the potentially very damaging image of Jews as subversives, as people who want to overthrow the government, but rather show the rest of the country that, on the contrary, Jews actually exemplify those ecumenical values that everybody really wants, and that, in fact, we, America, fought the war over. So this is one of the responses. One other aspect of the Rosenberg case is this. Just as I mentioned in the 1910 negotiations for the Protocol of Peace, when everybody in the room is Jewish, same thing with the Rosenberg case. The defendants, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, are Jewish. Their co-defendant is Jewish. And the main witness for the prosecution is not only Jewish, but who is he? As you may know, he was Ethel's brother, David Greenglass. The lawyers on both sides are Jewish. And who is one of the prosecuting attorneys? Speaking of McCarthy, a young Jewish lawyer named Roy Cohen. And the judge, Irving Kaufman, a Jew. And he is the person who sentences them to death. So again, we have American Jews on both sides of a very contentious issue, having this heightened awareness of the world looking at them, and looking at them not only as Americans experiencing this, but as Jews. What are the Jews going to do? What does this say about American Jews if you do this on this side, if you do this on the other side? We move again to completely different topics, but again, same question. What does it mean to be to have rights in America, especially as a religious minority? Two cases should, and there are many actually, should suffice to sort of put these questions in your mind. And, after our next topic, I'll take questions. So the first, and these aren't that long ago, this Supreme Court case that has to do with this little town in upstate New York only took place in the 1990s, in 1994. This is the town, these are signs in the town of a place called Kiryas Joel. It should be Kiryas Yoel. Don't ask me why. And every time I say the name of this town, my kids think I'm talking about Curious George, the monkey, but I'm not. This is a town in upstate New York, a little bit upstate, and it was founded by members of the Satmar Hasidic sect, where they were directed in the 1970s by their then Grand Rabbi, Teitelbaum. Currently, there are two Grand Rabbis of Satmar who are both his sons. And they were outgrowing their neighborhood in, in Brooklyn, New York. It was very, very overcrowded, which will happen when you have 12 kids in a family. And so Grand Rabbi Teitelbaum, Grand Rebbe, told some of his followers to go and buy some land in upstate New York, which they did. And they named it for him. Kiryas, the Hebrew word, means like a village. And so they named it, of course, after him. His first name was Yoel or Joel. And they lived there with many, many, many children, and that is relevant. And they were not comfortable that their children who, when they went to school, they couldn't afford to go to all private schools, because this is actually a very, very low income population. In fact, at the time, the village of Kiryas Joel had one of the highest percentages, or the highest percentage, of residents on welfare and on government assistance in the entire country. And so they figured out a different strategy, which was to have members of their community elected to the public school board, and then having the majority on the school board to vote for changing the calendar to accommodate Jewish holidays, changing dress codes in the school district to support more modest dress, and various other changes. The state of New York challenged this, and a case was brought, and yes, by Jewish lawyers, and they won. The state of New York. The Hasidic community, the Satmar community, then appealed it to the Supreme Court. A man some of you may know was a DC local, Nat Lewin, very well-known lawyer. He argued the case in court, as he generally does this type of case. And in fact, in that particular case, called Grummet v. State of New York, 1994, the Satmar community they were granted, they were not granted their appeal. The decision was that they were an identifiable religious community. They had argued that they should be considered a cultural group that wore the same kind of distinctive dress. But it was decided by a slim majority that this would violate the separation of church and state, the Establishment Clause in the First Amendment, and so they lost their appeal. Now, at this time, there was a new justice, pretty brand new justice on the court in 1994. Her name was Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She did eventually, she did join with the majority decision, but she actually brought up some really interesting probing questions, asked some very good questions for the lawyers representing the state of New York that really called into question some of their assumptions. I want to move quickly, so I want to bring up the other religious case, and then end with the topic of free speech. So the other case, also argued by Nat Lewin in the Supreme Court, had to do with public menorah lightings. Now, this actually came up last week again because it involved at a lower court level Amy Coney Barrett, brand new justice. So in 1989, a very similar issue arose, where members of a different Hasidic group, Chabad or Lubavitch, who, on the advice of their Rebbe, they had been conducting public lighting of menorahs, of Hanukkah menorahs, Chanukiot, in public spaces on government land, either federal government land, federal buildings, or town land, etc. And this was challenged. This was challenged by attorneys from the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. And in particular, the case was argued by a lawyer who happened to be Jewish, John Pushinsky. And his the opposing counsel representing Chabad Lubavitch was named, also Jewish, was named Charles Saul. And they're arguing the same issues. What does the Establishment Clause mean? What does it mean to practice or not practice religion in the public square? And what are the ramifications of being a religious minority in a country where you want to be able to exercise your religion freely, or you want to be able to decide not to exercise any religion? In this case, it was very, very interesting, sort of a split decision. Two cases were brought at the same time. One of them was this menorah case, and one of them was a case involving a creche, Christmas nativity scene, also on federal land. And the two cases were decided at the same time. This time, the court ruled that the creche was not constitutional, that they could not put the creche on government property, but that the menorah, the Chanukiah, was okay because there was a Christmas tree, which they deemed a secular object, and that it was very similar, and that the fact that the Jewish community was not being prevented from adding to public displays meant that their religious rights were being respected. Finally, but again, Jews are on both sides of the case. Finally, we get to the most famous case involving the issue of free speech. And again, we see Jews, American Jews, on both sides of the case. I'm sure many of you remember this. In response to the request by American Nazi leader Frank Collins to march with his followers wearing Nazi uniforms with swastikas on their arms and waving Nazi flags. His initial appeal was in 1977. The court case is in 1978. So in response to his request, he is denied through very complicated means, because he's being charged a lot of money, and because military garb it's decided that that's not allowed in a march, and various rules about the parks that he can and can't march in. So it's all very, very detailed. But the point is, he's denied. He feels that his right to free expression is being squelched, is being trod upon. And so who does he call? Who does the Nazi call? The Jewish lawyer. He calls the ACLU. And in this particular case, the lawyer who takes his case, David Goldberger, and the head of the Illinois office who tells Goldberger to take the case, they are both Jews. Not only that, the head of the ACLU at the time is not only a Jew, Aryeh Nair, but he himself is a refugee from Hitler's Europe. They all fiercely and without hesitation say to this Nazi, you should have the right to march. This is why we live in this country. But guess who doesn't agree with them? The large Holocaust survivor community and other Jewish community living particularly in the town of Skokie, Illinois, outside Chicago, where Collins is proposing to march. One weird little addendum to this whole story is that Frank Collins finds out that he has Jewish ancestry, which is, I think, not that unusual in some of these cases. This not only gets worldwide press, not only nationwide press, but it roils the Jewish community. It splits the American Jewish community in a way that I think arguably out of all of the cases I brought up, nothing else had. And that is because on the one side, we have Jews who are professionally dedicated to the protection of free speech, almost without exception. And it's no accident that all of the lawyers at the time, or all of the main figures at the time involved on the side of the ACLU are themselves Jews, even refugees. And at the same time, you have members of the American Jewish community, not only and especially the Holocaust survivors in Skokie, but leaders of synagogues around the country, et cetera. And I'm sure many of you remember better than I would what was going on these days. The rhetoric is at a fever pitch. David Goldberger, the ACLU lawyer, is getting death threats. He has to move his wife and children out of his house, because really this gets to brass tacks. This gets to, on the one hand, memories of a very recent series of events that are the worst tragedy that the Jewish people ever endured. And on the other hand, sort of the core principles that are supposed to make up the country that became a refuge for so many Jews. In the end, it's a mixed bag. Collins is allowed, he gets a permit to march in a different park, and he decides not even to have his march in Skokie, and he has his little march in Chicago, and I think it's, we had a party and nobody came. It really, it fizzles. The march itself isn't the point. But the lingering fissures that it exposed in not only the Jewish community, but in America writ large, really continue to bother people and to turn them over in their minds and can't decide what is right and what is wrong until recently. Oh, and the imagery of the Holocaust is rampant in this case. What happens recently? You all know what happens recently. Only 3+ years ago, we saw, of course, in Charlottesville, people marching with their tiki torches and murdering Heather Heyer with a car driven into a crowd of protesters protesting against the neo-Nazi and white supremacist march, the so-called Unite the Right March in August of 2017. And again, then and now, ever since then, the very, very fraught years that we've all experienced in this country in the last 4 years, give or take, are really, again, coming down to similar questions that were that people engaged with in these earlier cases, and especially in the Skokie case. But this time, it's actually a little bit different. And I'm sorry, but I can't give you a conclusion of this is how it ended. Because as we look, as we see what the developments have been over the last, especially 3.5 years, the escalation of anti-Semitism and racism and xenophobia online and elsewhere in the public square, we see also a very interesting development where places, businesses, and even people, not the ACLU, who had been on the side of free speech almost always, are starting to question not whether limits should be applied, but when limits should be applied. The principles are still there, but the expression, the murderous expression of some ideologies that end in not only words, but in actions, 2 years ago today, have really caused people to reconsider, and none more than the American Jewish community. We've seen Facebook and Twitter and YouTube responding to this in ways that they never would have even a year ago. So finally, I'm going to make another public service announcement to finish up here. And because I can't end with this, I can't end with what happened 2 years ago. I have to end with what the recourse is that American Jews and everyone else have always engaged in. What they've engaged in is public debate on both sides, and holding people in the public square accountable for their actions and their words, second guessing everything, not being afraid to stand up and question and challenge and assert their right to be here. And at the end of the day, doing one of the most important things that any of us can do, as Ben Shahn showed us in his poster a long time ago. So get out there and vote if you haven't already. Happy to take questions. I'm going to unshare. Matt?
Hi, thank you, Lauren. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to put them in the question and answer now. So far, we only have one question, and it's a question about, she wrote, "So interesting, wonderful presentation. I'm curious about how you became interested in the yin-yang of the Jewish experience in the US."
Thank you. Gosh, sort of like asking, how were you born? I mean, I've always been interested in Jews and politics, and I think that one of the fascinating things is that, even though I myself, big surprise, do come from the Jewish community, and my family's Jewish, I think American Jews are pretty darn interesting for anybody. It is hard to find. It's almost impossible to find, as I said at the beginning, a group that touches on so many of the aspects of not only being American, but being a citizen of the modern world. I was just lecturing yesterday to a bunch of undergraduates about the Dreyfus case and some other important cases in the 19th and early 20th century in Europe. And the Dreyfus case, I mean, that wasn't in America. That literally led directly to separation of, well, not directly, it was one of the factors that led to separation of church and state in France. And it led to certain practices in the press, political cartooning, all sorts of things. It's really extraordinary if you look at Jews and their involvement in the public square in the modern world, but especially in the United States, not limited to, and in Israel, frankly, whole different kettle of fish there, trying to this is something I teach about at AU, trying to navigate being a democracy and a Jewish state or a state for the Jews at the same time. There's almost no issue that comes up in these modern, especially democracies or countries that want to be democracies, that does not redound on the situation of Jews. And usually there's no situation that Jews have not at some point become involved in. I see a bunch of questions. Should I quickly look at them?
There's a couple on the outcome of the
Right.
Joel case.
And a few about Curious Joel and etc. So, okay. So a couple of questions about, well, first I'll do an easy thing, and then I'll talk about Curious Joel for a second. So yes, thank you. The person who mentions the legal case that has to do with Charlottesville, the Unite the Right rally. Yes, I'm very aware that there is a legal case that's been brought against the organizers and the main figures in the various white supremacist groups there. And in fact, I'm friends with the head lawyer who brought the case. And last year, gosh, it seems so long ago, was it only last fall, a course I taught at American University on Jews in the American political tradition, I brought the associate lawyer who's bringing the case to come and speak to my students, and it's absolutely fascinating. What they're doing, though, and they're wonderful and they're doing a great job, but I found it very interesting that their strategy is that they are not looking at it as a freedom of speech case. They're sticking to the facts of what happened those 2 days, August 11th and 12th. The fact that there's a what they're trying to prove is that there's a direct chain of events and in particular emails and texts that from the leaders of the various neo-Nazi and white supremacist groups that direct their followers to bring certain things that could be turned into weapons and to advertise it this way. And the lawyers are trying to draw a direct connection between that and the murder of Heather Heyer and the injuries to the other people, rather than making it this larger, more conceptual freedom of speech case, which is understandable if you're, tactically, if your point is to win the case. And as far as Curious Joel, the town, someone says, what is it like there now? I have not been there recently, but this person says that they've heard that that men and women are forced to walk on separate sides of the streets. Yes, I have also heard that as well. Hold on. And yeah, I mean, that is true in various communities, not only Curious Joel. There are signs, like the sign that one of the signs that I showed you in my slide, that say, kind of like when you go to Mea Sharim in Jerusalem, that say, dress modestly, women are not permitted into the neighborhood, whether or not they're Jewish or Chassid, doesn't matter unless they're completely, covered in a way that is acceptable to that community. So, yeah. And there was a different issue a couple of years ago with, again, not only Curious Joel, but other towns in the same area where there were buses. There was a bus system that had gender separation, in which women had to, get this, sit in the back of the bus. So, or not take the bus at all. So that was challenged in court. There's a lot going on. So someone else asks about a piece that I'm not familiar with, about Joshua Bernstein, about his father Norman's support of integration, sorry, and accusing other big Jewish property owners of racism. So that's a pretty broad generalization. And I didn't see the piece. I would love to see the piece, actually, if you could send it to me. But I know who Norman Bernstein is, and I'm not surprised that he had that he supported integration and liberal values. But I'm not familiar with the particular accusations of, if people were named in that piece. I do know, though, as I said, that in DC and in other places, there's a wonderful book about not exactly the same thing, but that covers a lot of this about Jewish real estate developers in Chicago, and it's a problem. I mean, if you view restrictive clauses and redlining as a problem, it is an issue that definitely is real, of Jewish builders and also owners of apartment buildings, et cetera. And as I said, in Washington, JUJ, I'll say again, some of their tactics were overboard. Maybe not in this area, but in other areas, they did not stint at calling out people and the Jewish names and Jewishness of people they disagreed with. And then some other Jews who were sort of more in the middle, were not on either end of the spectrum, were upset with them for, airing dirty laundry. And that's an issue that comes up a lot. Why can't you do this behind the scenes? This is embarrassing, etc. Let's see. Someone is saying, it's not really framed as a question, modernity and vaccines in religious communities. That's a great example. Yeah, a lot of people who are the loudest in decrying the sort of resistance, not sort of, the overwhelming resistance to some of the COVID era restrictions, and earlier than that, measles, the resistance to measles vaccines, the measles outbreak a couple years ago, which now seems like, measles. That conflict often, again, comes out in a Jewish context, including, as we've seen in some pretty ugly incidents in recent weeks, beating up of people from those communities themselves. A journalist who spoke out, a store owner who spoke out and said, and he wasn't even criticizing per se, he was saying that he believed that people should wear masks and that people, should follow restrictions. But lest you think that I'm furthering a negative view of a certain kind of community. Yeah, there is that, but there are also lots of examples of targeting of people in sort of overtly religiously ultra-Orthodox communities that is also not dealt with in a full or satisfying way. And we saw that as early as 1990-91 with the Crown Heights riots and protests in Crown Heights. And we've seen it the last few years as well. And we saw violence in Jersey City a couple of years ago with the kosher supermarket shooting, and that was actually less than 2 years ago, and that targeted people in the Orthodox community there. And other questions come up of when something like that happens, is there really a response that would be? Is there a response that is the type of response that perhaps would be elicited if this type of violence took place in other communities? Or is there a tendency among either some law enforcement or certain people, certain political views in this country to say, oh, well, you know, it's okay because they're ultra Orthodox and they look weird or they're doing this or that. So, you know, you'd say in Hebrew, gamze v'gamze. It's like it's both things, you know, both charges you can make. I'll just take a couple more because I know that we're at time. I sort of answered this. How do you account for the involvement of Jews in the public sphere? That's a question again that I ask myself every day. But I think I think that that I answered that because really it all affects Jews, and Jews affect all of it, and Jews also have tended to be pretty involved in certain kind of societies that they live in the diaspora. One fascinating thing, though, that was brought out in a recent book, was published 2 years ago, about the political behavior of American Jews, is that you cannot actually make that observation about Jews in all countries. And in fact, American Jews are unique in the extraordinary extent of involvement in the public square that they have. So that then brings up questions about, on the one hand, their Jewishness, yes, but also on the other hand, what it is about America and the American public square that encourages their involvement. And one of my favorite stories, and I think maybe I'll end with this, because I'm sorry, I'm not going to take a question about Trump, and I'm not going to take the wonderful question about how do I explain. I'll throw it out there, and it's certainly food for another lecture, and I have lectured on this, is what I have to say about American Jewish divisions about Israel. So that would be, that's a whole separate topic. But what I will say is that I've never been able to explain the following. 1654 is the sort of mythic beginning of the American Jewish community. And that's when 23 bedraggled Jewish refugees who had escaped from the island of Recife off the coast of Brazil, where they were pretty happily living while it was under Dutch rule. But now it had been taken over by the Portuguese. They won that whole area. That's why Brazilians speak Portuguese instead of Dutch. And so they won that whole area in the wars on the high seas. What was one of the first things they did? They take the island, they take the country, and they bring over the sea with them that lovely institution called the Portuguese Inquisition, which, yes, is the cousin to the Spanish Inquisition. There's also an Italian Inquisition. What do? The Jews in Recife, they scatter to the winds. They go to the Netherlands, they go to the Ottoman Empire. And this group of 23 Jews, they get on a boat and they think they're going to the West Indies. They get blown off course, they get attacked by pirates, and they finally land bedraggled on the shores of New Amsterdam, what we know of as New York. So two things happen. Number one, the first recorded action that we have, legal action of a Jew on American soil, is that a woman on the ship sues one of the other Jews on the ship. She files a lawsuit against him because she claims that he owes her money. Her name is Ricky Nunes. His name is Asser Levy. He's rather famous. So that amuses me, that the first recorded action is a lawsuit brought by a Jewish woman on this soil. But the second thing is more important, and that is that Asser Levy, greeted by the very virulently anti-Semitic Dutch governor of New Amsterdam, of the New Netherlands, all of New York's, what would become New York State, named Peter Stuyvesant, hates Jews. Think of that next time you're in Bedford-Stuyvesant. Asser Levy responds to Stuyvesant's anti-Semitism by doing a couple of things. He writes to Stuyvesant's bosses, the heads of the Dutch West Indies Company, complaining and reminding them that Jews are stockholders in their company. And he files a number of complaints, legal complaints, and political challenges to the obstacles that Stuyvesant throws up against the Jews who have just landed on these shores. And he wins, we don't obviously have time to go into, he wins most of his appeals. He has the right to purchase land for a Jewish cemetery. He has the right to worship, etc., etc. This is a group of people who were not politically active in the old world, but when they arrive on these shores, something happens. And they say, and this is before the United States, when its Constitution exists, they say we're in a different place. And we need to make this place be the kind of place that we want to live in. I cannot answer why, but it happened from the beginning. It happens every day. And I personally think it's a good thing that it happens, because I think this country would be a very different place, a lesser place, if the American Jews weren't so gosh darn outspoken. Thank you so much. Stay well. Hope I see you all in person one of these days soon.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Strauss, for an enlightening presentation. I'm sure our audience has much to reflect upon at this time.
You're always welcome to email me.
And thank you all for joining us tonight. I look forward to seeing you again this Sunday at 1 p.m. for our program with Professor Paul Lips and Rabbi Gordon Fuller. Have a good night.